Behind me is Toronto City Hall, and just over there is Old City Hall. But at one time, it used to be New City Hall. It's been through two main phases in its life so far. It even escaped the wrecking ball once. But now, its future is a bit uncertain. Before we talk about that, let's talk about its predecessor. When the town of York became the City of Toronto in 1834, it didn't have an official city hall. Meetings were held in part of the market building that used to be here. Today it's the site of St. Lawrence Hall, built in 1850 after the first Great Fire of Toronto destroyed the market building. I did a video about both of Toronto's great fires. There's a magic link above, and I'll put a link down in the description so you can find it when you finished watching this video. Here's a model of the original market building. The view is of the north side and shows the part of the building where meetings were held. Within about a decade, it was clear that the growing city needed a proper city hall. It was built immediately south of the market building on reclaimed land on the south side of Front Street, where the St. Lawrence Market South building stands today. It opened in 1845. Looking at this photo of it, you can see that the central portion was retained and incorporated into the current building, which was built in 1902 after the city government moved into today's Old City Hall. From inside the market, you can see the back of the original City Hall, which originally overlooked the lake. We've moved the Lake Ontario shoreline many times over the years. I did a video on that too, links in the usual places. The original council chamber on the second floor was the only room that wasn't demolished for the 1902 rebuilding and now hosts the Market Gallery. Toronto outgrew that City Hall too, and so in 1889 construction began on a new one. The architect was E.J. Lennox, who was responsible for a lot of notable buildings in Toronto from the late 1800s to the early 1900s. I did a video about him, you know where to find the links. The building took about a decade to build and went over budget, leading councillors to refuse to allow a plaque listing Lennox as the architect, so he had the stonemasons carve the message E.J. Lennox, Architect, AD 1898, one character at a time, into the corbels around the upper level of the building. Here are a couple of the letters. There are lots of faces in the architecture, some of which are said to be unflattering caricatures of the city councillors with whom he had disagreements. Lennox included one of himself, too. This dignified-looking one with the mustache is supposedly him. The clock tower, which was the tallest structure in Canada for nearly 20 years, is located off-centre so that it lines up with Bay Street to the south, providing this lovely view up the street. It wasn't just Toronto's City Hall. It also housed the regional government for the County of York, which at the time included both today's City of Toronto and York Region. And it hosted courts for both Toronto and York, which explains the sign over this entrance on the west side of the building. In 1953, Metropolitan Toronto was carved out of York County, and York's county seat and court moved to Newmarket. This vehicular entrance behind me on the north side of the building hints at something that you otherwise can't see from street level. This building doesn't occupy the entire block that it's on. Instead, it only occupies the outside of the block, with the courtyard on the inside, as you can see in this map of the ground floor. We'll talk about the courtyard again in a bit. Although it had supposedly been the largest civic building in North America when it opened, the city eventually outgrew this one, just as it had outgrown the previous ones, and so the current City Hall was built, opening in 1965. Around that time, Eaton's department store, which owned large parts of the land between Queen, Yonge, Dundas, and Bay Streets, wanted to demolish pretty much the whole thing to build a giant mall and office complex. They proposed keeping only the clock tower and cenotaph, although at one point apparently they even planned to knock down the tower. Eventually, after fierce opposition, the plans were revised, the Eaton Centre was built, and Old City Hall was saved. After the city moved out, the building was leased to the province and used as a courthouse, but most of the courts moved to a new courthouse just a couple of blocks away in 2023, and the last remaining courts left earlier this year, so the building is now vacant. So, what does the future hold for this heritage building? Well, some of the ideas that have been put forward for reusing the building in whole or in part include retail, public library branch, maybe a wedding venue with an event space in the courtyard. In 2018, City Council voted to study the possibility of putting a city museum in there. As far as I know, not much has happened on that, probably at least in part because the cost estimate for bringing this old building up to the standards necessary came in somewhere around $200 million. Another suggestion that's been floated, though not necessarily officially, has to do with the Ontario Legislative Assembly. The legislative building at Queen's Park is in desperate need of an overhaul. I mentioned that in my video about Queen's Park, yada yada yada. While that's happening, the Legislative Assembly needs a place to meet.
and this is one of the possibilities. At this point, there are more questions than answers, but this building's been through a lot over the years, and we'll just have to wait and see what the future holds. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you did, you know what to do. Please like and subscribe.